Lissa Paul is director of the PhD program in Interdisciplinary Humanities at Brock University. Her attention to the small and the overlooked has resulted in high-impact projects in multiple disciplines, including poetry for children, the foundational scholarly apparatus for studies in children's literature, the recovery of histories of 19th century Barbadian fugitive enslaved people, and the transnational life and letters of forgotten 18th century British author and teacher Eliza Fenwick.
Thanks, Paige. Okay. I've also got my timer on because we were told we had 6 minutes, so these are meant to be lightning talks. And on mine, I was also asked just to leave just one slide. So after this collage, there's just the one behind you, or should be behind you in a minute. There it is. Okay. Now, this talk is called Eliza Fenwick and Women Creating Social Safety Nets Before the Term Was Invented. Now, in case you aren't an Upper Canadian and don't recognize the person in the picture, it's clearly not Eliza, let me identify him for you. He was the famous Upper Canadian physician and lawyer, William Warren Baldwin. Along with his son, Robert Baldwin, both feature prominently in Ontario history as founding fathers of parliamentary democracy. And if you happen to be in Toronto and you visit Casa Loma, you can climb up long sets of Baldwin stairs, and that leads to the Baldwin Estates, and you can overlook, and there's still a commanding view of the city. Now, both Robert and William have extensive entries in, for example, the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, the Canadian Encyclopedia, and similar reference materials. What you won't find is anything about William Baldwin's wife, Margaret Phoebe, or 2 of his sisters, Elizabeth Baldwin Morgan and Mary Baldwin Breckinridge. Very little survives about these women, births, marriages, deaths. There's a short memoir by Mary Breckinridge. Now, the way I'm framing this talk is that it was only in the context of my Shirk-funded work on British author and teacher Eliza Fenwick and my attempts to find out how she landed up in Upper Canada, in Niagara and Toronto in the 1830s. And this is because she had come, so this is where you have to now use your imaginations. She had come from she'd been a promising British author in the 1790s, supporting emerging democratic liberatory philosophies, abolition. And she was living and working in a close circle of people who were basically who's who of anybody in the 18th century. Mary Wollstonecraft, William Godwin, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Aaron Burr, Tom Paine, you name it. She knew everybody. But from there, her transnational odyssey transformed her from radical author into conservative schoolmistress and businesswoman. Moving from radical London, she went to slave-dependent Bridgetown, Barbados, then to New Haven, New York, before arriving in Upper Canada in 1829. Now, this is a story of how she got from there to here, or here in my part of the country. And I partly covered it in the 2019 biography, but in a 2-volume scholarly edition of what will now be called the Fenwick Letters, 1797 to 1840, reconstructing a transnational social, cultural, and political life. I found myself so frequently awed by the ingenuity of women in Eliza's network. They were patiently, creatively supporting other women, and it wasn't charitable support. What they were doing wasn't just doling out money or doing charity. They were absolutely devising ways of making working lives and family lives viable. Now, in Eliza's case, she was essentially a single working mother with 2 young children. That's from about 1800. And by the time she arrived in Niagara, both her children were dead. She was a single working grandmother with her late daughters, 4 children to support, raise, and educate. So it's women without, she didn't have any family support, any other kind of support. And so she had to be able to figure out how to literally make it on her own. And at the time, it was by being a businesswoman, owning a school and running it. Now, it's here that the networking skills of William Warren Baldwin's wife, Phoebe, and his sisters, Elizabeth, Morgan, and Mary Breckinridge, come into play. Now, so this is where you have to sort of follow closely. In 1825, Eliza had relocated to New York with her daughter, Eliza Ann Rutherford, and grandchildren, and the son-in-law had abandoned the family in Barbados in 1818 in an attempt to run another school for girls. It was initially at Broadway and Bleecker in what's now Soho in Manhattan, and it was another seminary for young ladies modeled after the ones that she and her daughter had run successfully in Barbados. But Eliza Ann was failing, likely with congenital heart condition, and she died in 1827. Now, at that point, Eliza gave up the school, and in order to support her grandchildren, ran a kind of upmarket boarding house at 11 Bond Street, okay? 11 Bond Street in NoHo, so just north of Houston, still in Manhattan. Now, at number 14, so you've got Eliza at 11, you've got, at number 14, you've got John Jordan Morgan, later a congressman, and his wife. This is William Warren Baldwin's sister, Elizabeth. So 11 there, at 11, number 11 on Bond Street, there's a sister, Elizabeth Morgan, and Eliza at number 14. Now, meanwhile, in what's now Niagara-on-the-Lake, was William and Elizabeth's other sister, Mary Breckinridge. Now, Mary, in 1816, married a young lawyer named John, and he had actually interned at William Warren Baldwin's firm. Now, they relocated to Niagara-on-the-Lake, and John established a practice to start a family. Now, their eldest child, Maria, was born in 1817, a year after the marriage. In 1828, you got the dates, 1828 is when John died, leaving Mary in Niagara-on-the-Lake with 4 young children to support, and she was pregnant with her 5th child. Now here, finally, I'm coming to the end, I'm making the connection. Here is the way the Baldwin women put the social safety net they constructed for both Eliza Fenwick and Mary Breckinridge into action. Okay, so in 1820, so in that year, Elizabeth Morgan in New York, living almost next door to Eliza, knew that her grieving neighbor, former teacher and school owner, Eliza Fenwick, was trying to support 4 young grandchildren on her own. She also knew, of course, that her grieving, recently widowed sister, Mary Breckinridge, in Niagara-on-the-Lake, had 4, soon to be 5, young children to support. Now, there are no actual extant records of the conversation, but the families I could see in the other kind of material that I was researching, how those connections maintained and sustained over the years. But they figured out together how these 2 grieving women, Eliza in New York and Mary in Niagara-on-the-Lake, could embark on a sustainable beginning for themselves and their children for whom they were responsible, a new elite school for girls located at the remodeled offices of John Breckinridge at 240 Center Street. You can still see it at Niagara-on-the-Lake. So that's how, in 1829, Eliza, experienced teacher and author, moved with her grandchildren to Niagara-on-the-Lake to establish the Niagara Seminary for Young Ladies, with Mary Breckinridge, sister of William Warren Baldwin, and she was providing the location. The house was then that had been her husband's law office, transformed into a school. And the legal, moral, and emotional support from the Baldwin family when they were still in New York. Now, as Eliza's letters from the period indicate, the school was a success, and both women were clearly able to embrace their new project wholeheartedly, supporting each other and each other's children, and establishing new lives for themselves. In other words, they had, because of this kind of women supporting women, they'd figured out how to provide a way of sustaining these 2 families financially, socially, intellectually, emotionally. The building was adapted, but it's still there. As I said, But it still speaks very quietly to the unsung networking skills of the Baldwin women. And so I suppose it's time for those women to have some recognition too. Let's have some plaques or some signs for women helping women. Thank you so much.